time this country created a peculiar institution that subordinated Black people, slavery, Jim Crow, it created and dismantled it. They replaced it with another one.
Billion-dollar ambition.
And the iconic Black ghetto, I don't use that as a pejorative, I use it as a descriptor, was a follow-on institution to slavery and Jim Crow.
So the hood ain't the hood because Black people made it the hood. Rather, it was intentionally created by the government to oppress Black people through a federal policy that would adversely impact them for generations to come.
Precisely.
And this is the history of series.
The Harlem Renaissance was picking up speed by the middle years of the decade, and this empowered many Black Americans and struck fear into many whites.
69, 71, 72, we started blowing each other's brains out. 65, we were calling each other brothers. And so that's just a 5-year span. I'm saying, how do we go from being brothers in 5 years to kill that nigga?
We are from the South, so when we come to the city, we was confused about prejudice.
Racism and prejudice was the order of the day. It happened every day.
We couldn't go there, we couldn't go here, we couldn't go that. So I call us, we're not gangs, we are the pioneers that open up Los Angeles where that we can be in Centinela Park, where we could be across Crenshaw.
Existing gangs, the Slausons, the gladiators, the businessmen, who kind of like fought the white boys throughout the city. Then there's no white boys to fight.
Jesse Owens' Park used to be called Sportsman's Park.
After service in the Korean War, Clarence attended a speech by Malcolm X at the Nation of Islam's Temple No. 7. Shortly after hearing the speech, Clarence joined the Nation of Islam and was renamed Clarence 13X. Clarence was an avid student of Malcolm X and of NOI literature and lessons. In 1963, Clarence 13X began teaching his NOI students that the Black man collectively is the original man and God. He rejected the NOI doctrine that its founder Wallace Fartt Muhammad was Allah. Between 1963 and 64, 13X left the Nation of Islam and founded the 5% Nation.
Instead of it being called civil rights in the future, we're going to have to label it a human rights struggle or the struggle for human rights. And as such, we can then take it into the United Nations through the avenues that have been set up
New York,
by the United Nations.
On February 21st, 1965, Brother Malcolm X fell before the bullets of assassins. His killers were those whose interest he knew would crumble before the irresistible forces of worldwide revolution against racism and dollarism.
Riots broke out in many cities. 36 died at once in 65.
Just one incident too many in August 1965. Carload of guys not bothering anybody pulled over by the highway patrol. The LAPD come on the scene, slap a woman. They try and push people around. Some people begin to fight back. And it spreads like lightning through the community. It was an absolutely transforming event.
When you take something away from a community or people, the community will replace it with something. When you took the leadership away in the 60s, the youth replaced it with something. We seeked our own leadership. We felt basically that the leaders of the 60s failed us because we didn't quite comprehend what they stood for.
A lot of the documentaries say we were behind the Black Panthers movement and this and all that shit. No, we thought none of that shit. So for anyone to say that and make documentaries and put the Black Panthers, the movement, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and all that kind of shit, no, don't do that. Don't disrespect those guys that was trying to stand for something for real. You understand what I'm saying? Because we wasn't standing for nothing but ourselves. You understand what I'm saying? Like out of control fire. That's what I said we were. We're out of control fire. We're burning up everything that's in our path.
The act of violence totally on the people, without the people fighting back, it didn't make any sense to youngsters. So we formed our gangs and we dealt with our own brand of leadership. Today they call it Bloods and Crips.
They said that the Crips and the Bloods did not start from a rebellion against oppression. Was not started like the Black Panthers to try to emulate the Black Panthers or any of that. But however, here in the Bronx, New York, the Black Spades was that group of teenagers. You know, they was that African-American youth gang that did form at first to fight against oppression, to stand up and protect themselves against Caucasians that dominated the Bronx.
It was amazing how fast we got big. It was amazing. Once we beat up socialoids, and beat up the Golden Guineas.
Golden Guineas.
Yeah, it's a Caucasian gang.
As far as our great history of African-American rebellions, that's what made the Black Spades different than a lot of other rebellions, because it was led by teenagers. It was a group of teenagers rebelling against the American oppression. And basically they won. You know, they won their fight against oppression.
New York was so powerful, the New York area was so powerful that the only way they could stop New York in the 70s was influx of drugs and guns, man.
You don't stop the rockin' to the bang bang boogie. Say up jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie beat.
In 1979, the dictatorial government of Nicaragua was overthrown by socialist revolutionaries called the Sandinistas. In response, right-wing groups known as the Contras began a brutal paramilitary campaign, receiving money and weapons from the CIA as part of the Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union.
If we cut off the freedom fighters, we will be giving the Soviets a free hand in Central America, handing them one of their greatest foreign policy victories since World War II.
The federal government first banned the recreational use of a substance, opium, in the early 1900s. Then came the Prohibition era, which focused on alcohol. Shortly after, the feds began to track and vilify people who struggled with addiction, especially if they were Black.
After the freedom of Paris, Miles returned to the harsh reality and racism of New York. The jazz scene was in decline, and white musicians got most of the work.
The Mob Museum says that Prohibition, jazz, and the mob all went hand in hand. The Mafia owned the clubs and made sure there was booze, and jazz musicians provided the perfect musical accompaniment to the evening's revelries.
Crack kingpin Freeway Ricky Ross is not only the biggest drug dealer from California, he's also the most well-known. He did this by securing a steady cocaine supply from Nicaragua and becoming one of the first big-time drug dealers to cook cocaine into crack.
Even though we know COINTELPRO brought the drugs in.
In the 80s, you know, people say that the government, or whoever, quote unquote, the government, dumped a lot of drugs into, you know, inner city neighborhoods. And it's like, when you put that on a spectrum.
And their main connect in California was Rick Ross, and Rick Ross flooded the Crips and the Bloods with the drugs, and then the drugs flooded throughout the neighborhood.
In the book titled Once Upon a Time in Compton, there's two Compton police, Tim and Bob, who say they first began to notice rock cocaine in 1983. And that's when things very quickly began to spin out of control.
Is it a coincidence? The same year hip-hop had its first own radio station in 82, that the government, CIA, put crack in the community.
Tyrone Fly Ty Williams, a hip-hop legend and icon, alongside Mr. Magic, was responsible for bringing the first ever rap radio show to a major New York station, WBLS, in 1982.
On the heels of 1982, the largest shipment of cocaine ever seized at LA Harbor, 150 pounds with a street value of $34.5 million, was seized by Los Angeles police and federal agents in a series of arrests that centered around a Colombian freighter docked in San Pedro. And Contra scandal and its impact in the streets of Los Angeles to the birth of West Coast hip-hop, Los Angeles was turned all the way up.
By 1983, the epidemic had taken hold of the city, turning communities into war zones. And soon, crack became a national crisis.
To fund the war.
Meanwhile, in another part of the world, the United States was funding an illegal war in Nicaragua, and drug smugglers were sending cocaine to the US on US planes. Somehow, the United States officials had no clue.
The story of the CIA and crack cocaine doesn't actually begin on the streets of LA or Miami. It begins in the jungles of Central America.
They made crack dealers get 5 years minimum for 5 grams, but coke dealers had to get caught with 500 grams to get 5 years. That's because crack was a poor people drug and coke was a rich people drug.
From the beginning, there are plenty of white people smoking crack.
It was really the first time I smoked it that I knew I didn't want to stop.
Everybody I used with was white. You know, they didn't get caught because they had money, more money than me. They weren't in the street yet.
But the media focuses almost exclusively on the black neighborhoods.
Drug dealing has reached epidemic proportions among young black men here.
How old are you? 16, sir.
Our television sets were saturated with images of, black men in handcuffs.
It fed into the worst fears that people had, not just about the drug, but about who the drug was associated with.
The idea of a threat coming from Black America relative to crack cocaine was to create a sort of massive hysteria.
It's going nationwide, especially among the young.
If smaller cities don't have a crack crisis now, they will soon.
Now it's spreading across the nation.
Crack has become America's drug of choice.
Today, there's a new epidemic. Smokable cocaine, otherwise known as crack. It is an uncontrolled fire.
Reagan's Anti-Drug Abuse Act imposed harsher sentences on crack than traditional cocaine use, leading to a decades-long debate that the law was unfairly targeting minorities and lower-income neighborhoods who couldn't afford the more expensive cocaine powder. Incarcerations in LA skyrocketed. By 1995, the California Department of Corrections increased its black and Latino inmates from 21,476 to 88,376, more than a 400% increase. This led to broken families, an overblown foster care system, increased violence, and a growing skid row that crippled the nation. That's until a long overdue correction was made. In 2010, Obama put an end to Reagan's Anti-Drug Abuse Act. While many feel it was too little too late, it was a step towards correcting a racially skewed prison system.